Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Stinemetz brothers, and we are the pseudo scholars. This podcast is our schoolhouse, and each week we grapple with our own realities by challenging the stuff we think we know and exploring what interests us.
Yeah, we're interested in exploring things like space exploration, or the question of why human beings commit suicide, or stuff that's really simple, like why are the New England Patriots so much better than everybody else in the NFL for the last 10 years? These are the kind of ideas that we want to break down. We want to challenge our own conventional thinking, and then hopefully everyone is going to walk away informed, stimulated, and inspired.
And right now we're jumping into part 2 of our 2-part series on the transportation revolution. There's a lot of exciting, disruptive technological changes that are going on with the automobile. Last week, we talked about the electric vehicle and answered the question of whether or not it's here to stay and its impacts on not only the environment, but also the kind of economic status of the automobile. Today, we're taking a look at the autonomous vehicle, the car that drives itself.
Yeah, so the autonomous vehicle is going to change our world in some unbelievable ways. And so as we think about this intro, it might be a little bit futuristic, but I think you'll see after we get through our content, it's really not as far out of an idea as you might think.
Yeah, and one way to consider that is to think about the bystander in New York City in 1905 or something, when that first Model T putted on by and they saw the automobile, and what did they think to themselves? I can only imagine, hey, I want to get one of those, or what is that thing? Oh, that thing's not going to be a big deal. It doesn't even look like it works properly. Who knows what people thought? But I think that we're probably standing on the precipice of a change quite similar to that when we're talking about the autonomous car. But why are we talking about the autonomous car right now, Cade? I think the real question is, what is happening today in our current climate, economic climate, technological climate, that's causing us to have this discussion today? Because MIT and Stanford researchers have been working on autonomous cars for a few decades now.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And we can even harken back to the early 1900s and proliferation, starting in the 1950s, where scientists were making statements. Now, they didn't have the answers, and we don't quite have the answers today, but definitely saw that people operating vehicles was just not going to be the way that the future would allow transportation to evolve. And so what we're seeing now is all of the technology growth that we've seen in the last several years start to really transition towards some of the biggest economic and social problems of our day, and driving is right up there amongst the best of them.
Yeah, well, I think there's maybe 4 primary areas where a lot of things are coming together at the exact same time that are driving this technology forward. So the first one is computers. It's no secret that computing power has progressed along with Moore's law to this point where processing powers are incredibly powerful. And now computers can finally distinguish between objects. So think about a computer with vision driving down the street and being able to identify a cone from another car, from a human being, from a traffic light. Now computers have that ability, and processors have the ability to make all that happen in a single autonomous vehicle.
Right. So computers are certainly one of those pillars upon which this revolution is being built. The other is something we're all familiar with, and that's the amazing idea of ride sharing. So these two companies, especially Uber and Lyft, have done something to revolutionize the transportation market, right? And so autonomous car technology is still really, really expensive now. But over time, as we develop that technology, what it's going to happen is it's going to really lower the cost of transportation. And companies like Uber and Lyft, where their primary expense is going to be paying people to drive those vehicles, are no longer going to see those kind of expenses. And so they're going to proliferate and grow at a tremendous rate.
Another thing that's happening around the same time as these other two components would be the electrification of cars. We're hearing a lot about the electric vehicle, as we talked about in our last episode. And something that's interesting is that every single autonomous car company is building their platform on the electric vehicle, not on the internal combustion engine. So that's Uber, that's Google, it's Mercedes, it's Audi, and it's Honda. Those are kind of the big players in the bucket right now, outside of a few startups, Tesla, of course.
Right.
But then the primary reason for this, Cade, isn't necessarily relating to the environment, although they'll like to throw that out there as one of the advantages. It's really an economic advantage. what I've learned is that if one of these companies is going to try and consolidate the market or like kind of take over the autonomous car market, what they'll probably end up doing is creating an entire fleet of cars. And that whole fleet will support a specific region. So imagine in Los Angeles, there being a fleet of 10,000 Uber cars, and they're all electric. Now, the upfront costs of buying an electric car right now are higher than buying a standard internal combustion engine, but it's the long-term maintenance costs that are much lower when it comes to maintaining batteries and maintaining the electric motor. So that's why most of these companies are investing in building giant fleets of electric vehicles.
Right, right. Absolutely. So that's the third pillar. And the last pillar is just good old fashioned American entrepreneurialism, right? Our capitalistic society creates tons of opportunities for technologies that we could have never dreamed of, or maybe we only dreamed of and never thought would really materialize. But Google leading the charge with AdWords capital and making so much money off web advertising has really allowed their company to diversify and really spend billions and billions of dollars doing research in a lot of spaces that maybe they're not going to see immediate profit or returns, but long term, they're going to do things that are going to change the world and ultimately lead Google into an even more powerful position in the economy. So really just looking at those last three, it's the laws of supply and demand. It's the laws of economics that are really opening up what is going to be a massive opportunity for the transportation industry.
Yeah, the time is now. The time is right. It's coming in our lifetime, certainly. Probably in the next decade, we'll not be surprised when we see an autonomous electric vehicle driving down the road. Whether we'll own one or not is yet to be determined. But the big questions are, what are the benefits? Why does it seem so great to have an autonomous car versus driving a car? I kind of like driving my car.
Right. Yeah. Well, but now that we set the stage a little bit, Shane, as we get into a pretty dense conversation here with a lot of different points that need to be made, I kind of just want to start us off with a story. So just kind of imagine yourself waking up on a Monday morning ready for work, right? So most of us are still getting in cars and we're driving. So I wake up, you're a little bit late. Maybe your alarm clock didn't go off, or maybe you hit the snooze button too many times. You forgot to go get groceries, so you're stuck trying to figure out something to eat for breakfast. All those kinds of little idiosyncratic parts of your day lead to you just running a few minutes behind, something really, really simple. But as you get to your car, or maybe you haven't completely finished dressing, or you haven't tucked in your shirt or tied your shoes, right? And so you're pulling out. You're looking at your phone because you're trying to figure out whether or not you have a meeting that you're going to be late for. You pull into the left lane thinking that no one's going to be there, and boom, someone's right there, right up on you, and they crash right into you. That's a circumstance that happens so many times that the statistics are really staggering. And so when you think about that, little things like that, little things in the human system that cause us to overlook small details, or all of these little things that are happening way before I ever enter into a vehicle, are affecting my safety on the road. And it is a sobering thing to think that autonomous cars and new technology could go towards addressing what might be the greatest problem outside of biological disease in our American society today.
This is where things get really crazy when you look at the statistics, Cade, of how dangerous we are as drivers. 1.3 million fatalities globally in a year. That's last year in 2016. How on earth as a society do we just kind of nod our heads and stand by and accept the fact that nearly 1.5 million people were killed around the world? And now let's bring it home. In the United States, 40,000 fatalities. So 110 people are dying in a car crash every single day. 110 people died today. And if you do some kind of crazy comparisons, that actually ends up being more fatalities in a single year, 40,000, than if you were to combine a single year of the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the War of 1812, and the American Revolution. Combine 1 year of all the fatalities, and we're killing more people in cars in the United States in a given year.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely staggering. And for people that don't know some of these statistics, it's really important to kind of reform your opinion, because I know I consider myself to be a fairly safe driver outside of that example that I gave about, turning into the wrong lane or something like that. I consider myself to be a pretty safe driver. And so I think, maybe some of these car wrecks are caused by, I don't know, some, some debris on the street, or some kind of structural design problem with a road or weather or things like that. But the fact of the matter is that 94% of accidents, 94% of these accidents are caused by driver error. They're caused by the human condition.
And it's the leading killer of human beings between the ages of 1 and 40. That's another crazy one to wrap your head around. If you're between the ages of 1 and 40, you're more likely to die in a car than in any other circumstance. So I think it's undeniable that safety could be the single biggest driver in favor of the autonomous vehicle. I mean, and now the Google car seems to be proving that it's just that. It's safe. It did something like 700,000 autonomous miles without a crash, which is far better than my driving record.
Right. No, we all remember your driving record from high school, but anyways, yeah, no, that's completely true. And albeit there being some reports about the driverless car that Uber crashed the other day, we have to really look at these things on scale, to metrics like crash per mile, to really understand, because the fact of the matter is that most people that are resistant to technological change, and the statistics tell us that most people are going to see kind of anecdotal evidence like that and kind of put it out of their mind and cast it aside as something that they'd never do. In fact, I'll introduce it right now. I was talking to a guy at work about this today, and he said, I will never, get into a driverless car. And I was just kind of sitting there trying to fight with him, saying, oh, you don't really have a choice, man. It might be law by the time you die. So
I think there could be an ethical argument that would say we would no longer allow human beings to get on the road and drive giant tin cans at 70 miles per hour. Why would we allow humans to do that when it's clear that we're not very good at it? But you make a very good point. I think there will be quite a bit of backlash. There'll be a lot of regulation surrounding a few of the incidents. The most notable ones are the 2 Tesla fatalities. So people who turned on Tesla's autopilot essentially and died. It seems that both were based off of user error. But nonetheless, people are going to be worried. Oh my gosh, the machine killed me. And the idea of a machine killing a human being seems a lot more consequential than humans killing humans. But the reality is, if the machine is responsible, or makes some errant decision when it has the choice between hitting an old grandma and hitting a 6-year-old kid, these are some of the difficult ethical questions that might come into play. When the machine makes a decision that we don't agree with, the realities are that the statistics are still going to probably be in favor of the machine that we are programming.
Yeah, I think what we're going to see over time as this technology really develops and becomes mainstream is that we're going to be dealing with the same kind of problems that we deal with all new technologies. Number one, we don't really understand it right now because it's never really existed. So how are we supposed to regulate something from a governmental standpoint and really understand all of the complex ethics around it? We're not going to for a little while, and that's okay. That's true of all technology. All technology can be used for bad purposes. So that's going to be a challenge. And then also just user adoption based on kind of psychological barriers to things that are just uncomfortable. And I can think of it like, is it really that different than flying a plane, right? You look at the statistics of flying in a plane, but I know people that won't get on a plane because it makes them so uncomfortable and so scared. But really, we're going to have to hope that rationale and logic drives out some of those fears. And I commiserate with them. But at the end of the day, there's no doubt that long-term, this is going to be a much better option for us from a safety perspective.
Yeah, and there are 2 more factors relating to safety, not just in the fact that we kill people driving our cars, but we got to think about the taxi landscape as well. So people kill taxi drivers. It happens. People hurt taxi drivers. Taxi drivers hurt people. There have been a number of cases recently with taxi drivers and Uber drivers raping women late at night. They pick women up at bars, and then they're the first victim. Because the Uber system, for whatever reason, maybe isn't screening their drivers as effectively as they potentially could. But regardless, wherever there are 2 humans who don't know each other and there's the potential for violence and harmful activities, it usually takes place. So for the woman who's leaving the bar alone at night at 1 a.m., does she prefer to get in an electric autonomous car, or does she prefer to get in the car with a stranger that she's never met before? Another benefit of the autonomous car.
No, that's a good point. It kind of makes me think about the challenges that Craigslist has had with people setting it up and doing things. But except for, guess what? When I go to knock on the door to complete my transaction of my Craigslist product, in the metaphor, there's no one there. It just transacts automatically. So that's really what we're talking about. So I think that's also a fair point to talk about when it comes to the safety perspective. But maybe it's time to move on a little bit to how this could change kind of the urban landscape. Shane, because as you know, and most people know, the globally, people are moving back to the cities at a rate that we really have not seen before. And living in a massive city, you know, the fastest growing city in the United States right now in Houston, Texas, I can attest to this with firsthand personal experience that we do not use our land inside of the city efficiently. It is unbelievable the number of highways, the number of spaces that are really set aside for vehicles, for parking, for driving, the mass congestion, traffic. All those things are going to be things that we think that this is going to really play a big role in changing.
Right. And MIT Labs is making some projections. Naturally, they're at the forefront of a lot of the urban planning, and they have a center for urban planning, which I never realized until doing some preparation for the podcast. But based off some speculations, they're saying that there could potentially be 80% fewer cars on the highway if we move to an autonomous version of city transportation. So that's frees up people to have much shorter commute times. Basically, cars become on demand. Cars would probably be parked outside of city limits in some massive parking facilities, and on demand, zoom in, scoop you up, and take you to the destination of your choosing. So they wouldn't have to be parked inside the city. And that's where things get really, really cool, because it is surprising how much of our cities are made up of space devoted to our cars, starting with parking. This blew my mind. In Los Angeles, 15% of the entire city is parking spaces.
Yeah, that is absolutely staggering. But Shane, just to hit on your point a little bit so I can understand it, when we say 80% fewer cars on the highway, obviously we're still assuming that everybody is kind of working, going to the same jobs that they've always gone to, except for maybe in a self-driving vehicle. So is that number predicated upon the fact that lots of space inside the cities near the workplaces that are not residential now will turn residential because the cars will be displaced into some kind of facility outside of the city? Is that the point?
Partially. I think there's really two contributors. One is that people are moving back into the cities. So as people have the abilities to go and move back into the cities, because, for example, that giant parking deck that your company just built gets converted into residential space, then all of a sudden it's affordable for people who live outside the metropolitan area to get a 3-bedroom condo inside the metropolitan area. So perhaps they move back in, and therefore there's no more requirement for them to get on the highway in the morning and commute into Phillips 66 to the big companies. So there's that component. And then there's the component that it relates to car ownership. So it's very likely that metropolitan-based, individuals like yourself and like myself will choose not to own cars at all, because cars will be on demand. It'll be much more affordable. We'll get into the financial a little bit later. But the idea of not owning a car means that you could on demand complete your travels along the highway, rather than just kind of regular free travel on the highway where a single person is sitting in a single 5-car SUV. Now we're talking about a single person sitting in a singular person vehicle, and we can talk about what that singular vehicle would look like, much smaller. Another reason why traffic would be freed up on the interstates.
Yeah, no. That makes a ton of sense. And this is a little bit more easy to identify with, and imagine if you've been to a city recently where people don't really own cars, where it is much more compact. See, this is really hard for people in Houston to identify with and grasp, because it's so spread out. You can't imagine not having to drive to different places. But, I was up in Boston this past weekend, and that's the kind of place where people that live downtown or in Cambridge or these little pockets, it's such a compact city that really owning a car has become almost unfeasible. Not only just convenient because of how much of a challenge it is getting it in and out and paying for parking and things like that, and the time it takes to do all of those things. It's really become a much more efficient way to live without cars if you live in that type of place. So I've got to imagine that this is going to expand a lot quicker in certain places, while other cities are going to have to, over time, kind of evolve into places that are more conducive for self-driving vehicles.
Right. And one interesting question will be made is, which city is going to be the first to truly adopt a fleet of autonomous cars? And how is that going to transform that city? Is it going to be the San Francisco Silicon Valley, or is it going to be a sleeper like Pittsburgh out there? Who knows who it's going to be, whether it could be Houston or not. But I can tell you, because I've been living this life now for a year and some change, Chelsea and I, my wife, we don't own cars. We live deep in the cities so that we can walk to everything that we need to walk to, or take public transportation. And when we actually need an automobile, like we've used probably 5 times in the last 3 months, it's to get to and from airports for some purpose. and we just hire the taxi service. It ends up being a lot cheaper. So I think, unless you have another point on that, Cade, we could jump into the cost benefits of autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, no, I want to get into the cost because with my economics background, I love talking about the numbers because at the end of the day, this is going to be the most important factor in self-driving vehicles really expanding to the extent that we're kind of dreaming about. So
adoption, right? So let's get into it a little bit. So basically, consider the American family and how much money they spend in a given lifetime. Their single greatest expense is housing, not surprisingly. Whether it's buying homes or renting cars over the course of a lifetime, it adds up. But the second biggest expense for the American family are cars. 92% of a car's lifetime spent parked is spent parked. So what does that say about the investment of the average American who's spending, in terms of total expenses, their second largest expense over the course of a lifetime on an asset that spends 92% of its life parked, sitting, accumulating, decreasing in value, requiring additional maintenance, paying for insurance. All of these things basically work themselves out to where the average American is spending upwards of 13 grand for a car that's only doing about 14 hours of work per week. So that's a week. 13 grand a week, the average American spends on cars, rather a year, 13 grand a year, and they're only using it for 14 hours a week.
Yeah, it's just when you think about it, it's kind of amazing when you think about this problem, how obvious it becomes that this is just a terrible way of doing things. Like, well, I'm not charged for electricity until I flip on my switch, right? To think about just leaving your lights on all day and paying for power. It's somewhat similar of a concept. That's what it takes to own the car because we just can't regulate down to seconds into minutes and be that accurate. So you have just this massive gap of time for insurance and time for paying for costs when you're not using it. And it really is just an inefficient way to spend money. It's an inefficient way to consume goods. You're not internalizing all of that cost. And so that's going to lead to people being not very responsible. And I can imagine what the average American family would do with an extra 13 grand a year. That's a lot of money.
Right. And there'll be the naysayers who would say, oh, but if I don't own a vehicle, the cost of paying for taxis is going to certainly outweigh the cost of owning that vehicle, the $14,000. But I actually saw a pretty interesting experiment. I don't remember the number specifically, but there was this fancy millionaire guy living in New York City who decided to get rid of his car entirely. He was driving his car to and from work every single day. And then he worked out the finances and basically decided to eliminate his car. And he took an Uber every single day, a private Uber to and from work for every single day. And over the course of the entire year, he ended up spending less money taking an Uber 5 days a week, twice per day, than owning a car in Manhattan. So, it's going to certainly build up. And then there's the fact that we're talking about taxis that would be autonomous. So right now he's paying for an Uber and an Uber driver. And it's about 85% of a total taxi cost that's going towards that driver. Let's remove the driver and consider how much the taxi costs now. Now it's quite affordable.
Yeah, absolutely. And for people that have used these self-driving businesses before, Uber is obviously the big player in that space. But lots of other companies do ride sharing. Lots of other people are trying to get in on this big pot because they know that it's the future. So even if costs go up tremendously at the very beginning because there's just a few players and their costs go down 85% and all of a sudden Uber's making a lot more money and maybe they have too much control over the market, I think that the answer is long-term, it will settle. People are, if it's not economically viable to switch to ride sharing as a permanent response to not owning a car, people won't do it. So Uber and Lyft and other companies like that are going to have to make it affordable. They have to. They won't exist without it. So that's just something to remember when we're talking about this space. But one thing, Shane, I wanted to hit on is that not only was it cheaper for that guy in New York to not own a car, but certain things that can't be predicted, like how about car maintenance? That's something that you'll never have to consume again. We're not even just talking about what it costs to operate your car, which is expensive, but we're talking about when you get a flat tire on the side of the road. We're talking about when someone dings your door and it's a $500 deductible, or when you total your car and you don't have the right types of insurance. I mean, there's amazing costs that are really associated with this.
Yeah. And the more we get into this, the more crazy it seems to own an automobile. And then we could talk about just the waste of time in terms of how much time we spend manually operating a car that could be spent with our loved ones or could be spent doing other work. I know for me, when I lived in Silicon Valley, the commute in was pretty wasteful. And oftentimes I was being rushed straight into a conference meeting or something. And I didn't really have the ability to prepare in advance. So I'm sitting in traffic, manually operating this vehicle, when if it was driving itself, I could be sitting in the back, comfortably going over my notes and preparatory materials so that I walk right in, took it out of the park.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So there's a few other kind of factors in terms of how driving can be just a big waste of time. What if we were able to stay connected or stay better connected with our friends and loved ones? The big one is texting, right? We are so integrated at this point in our lives that when your wife texts you and says, "Don't forget to stop and store," and you're driving, you can't help but not say, "Okay, babe, I'm getting it now." She wants that response. You want to send her that response. But with a machine driving the car, no problem. You can stay integrated in that regard. You can be on FaceTime. You can be on social media. And then there's the entertainment. You could play, right? That's probably going to be a big industry. I mean, Netflix is the king of on-demand television. Now we're talking about on-demand transportation. I could see a world in which people are in the virtual and reading books in the backs of their car while they're commuting an hour into the city.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Eating. I mean, the list goes on and on of what you could do with more time. But what excites me is when you give the average American more money back into their pocket and you give them more time. I'm just thinking about what the potential is for economic growth. People are going to be inventing companies during that time. People are going to be doing amazing things. They're going to be learning languages. They're going to be studying things that are really, really interesting to them. They're going to be doing what is most valuable with their time at that option where we give them an actual choice, whereas before they've never had a choice of what to do during that time. And you've seen that people want that time back because we've done the most we can with technology to make it as hands-free as possible to be listening to podcasts or making phone calls or texting, things like that. So it's definitely amazing to think of what that creative potential could unlock for people.
Definitely. So we're here selling it for sure. Clearly, we're both believers, and we're not making any buts about that. But there must be some things that are going to hold us back. Truthfully, can we answer the question, when is this going to happen? Adoption look like? I'd say I think it probably starts today. I mean, we know that Uber is doing this in Pittsburgh as we speak, which is pretty cool. The reason I referenced Pittsburgh earlier is because Uber got kicked out of my beloved city, San Francisco, because they couldn't get their regulatory bodies in order. And so they sent them down to Pittsburgh, and now Pittsburgh gets to be the proving grounds of the autonomous car. So right now, when you hail an Uber in Pittsburgh, you could potentially be getting into a driverless car. Now, there's a safety driver in the side seat. So I guess the real question becomes, when are we going to get rid of that driver, that safety mechanism? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, so sorry you cut out there a little bit earlier, but yeah, I think we're several years down the road. But one thing that's important to recognize about this is that this has been incremental change over a long period of time, like most things, right? How about cruise control? People haven't thought about that. That's part of the evolution of self-automating or self-driving vehicles. Talk about lane control, right? We talk about braking, emergency brakes when it senses that it's getting too close. We're talking about parking assistance. We're talking about parallel parking. So most all of those technologies have been going over time and have been growing. And so you think that it's really only a matter of time before the final switch comes. I've read, Shane, that 2020 is going to be a big year for the automobile industry in general, right? We're talking about a big year for electric vehicles. We're talking about a big year for self-driving vehicles. And so to me, it's really a matter of when is the market going to focus on this and push this last little element through the hole, so to speak, because I think we're getting very close. I mean, we're doing it. Google is doing it. So how long is it going to take before the technology becomes economical? And then when are all the other big automakers going to start pumping out self-driving cars and doing all of their kind of testing, and not just these high-tech companies? And I think they're doing some of that right now.
Definitely. The really cool factor when it comes to adoption with autonomous cars is that it's something that can essentially happen overnight. Technology adoption happens in waves, and there's various ways in which people track this stuff. But when you talk about transportation adoption, it's generally pretty slow. You brought this up in our last podcast. The average car on the road is 11 years or whatever. So basically, Americans are waiting 11 years before they've saved up enough money and they're willing to invest in the newest technology and go out and buy the newest Honda Accord. So it's kind of a slow process. But we're not talking about be in line with that transportation curve. We're talking about something that's going to be much more rapid, something that's much more following the lines of a standard technological adoption. And that's because we're not talking about people buying autonomous cars. Yeah. When will humans actually be able to purchase autonomous cars, on an average basis? I suspect that's still a very long ways off. I've seen numbers that say as much as 20 years before it would be affordable for us to do that. But we're talking about a world in which singular entities, large corporations like Uber, buy giant fleets. And so for adoption, like downloading the app. And once regulation has taken place, that'll be a bit of a slow process. But basically, once regulation has taken place, the technology's there now, practically. Yeah. It's just a matter of stepping outside of your door and going onto your app. And when you go into Uber for that very first time and you see the autonomous option or you see the manual option, you make that choice. And by choosing to choose autonomous, you're right then and there. So it could happen really, really fast once these fleets hit the road.
No. I think that's a really, really good point, is that we're not trying to worry about the masses adopting this technology. Now, obviously, they've got to click the button on their app for it to proliferate, but really we're talking about big, powerful companies that are going to raise tons and tons of money because they're going to see how this is going to drive down costs over time. So in that sense, it's actually really unique as a technology because it's going to be passed to consumers. So Uber is going to spread the big time cost of this out over millions and millions and millions of people pressing a button for their $5 cab ride.
Exactly. So I would suspect that regulatory bodies are the biggest prohibitor in early adoptions, say going forward in the next year or two. But 2020 sounds pretty realistic to me. And it's going to be fun to see which city conquers it first. Maybe that'll be the city that I move to. But who knows who's going to get this thing nailed down first. What I do think is interesting to talk about is the negative consequences. And there are legitimate ramifications for a lot of hardworking Americans. And we need to talk about who's going to get eaten. And when I talk about who's going to get eaten, I'm talking about what this disruptive technology is going to come in, and it's going to eat a lot of other industries. So who's going to get eaten, Cade?
Yeah, well, obviously what we're talking about here is professional drivers. So we're seeing it in the cab companies already, right? We're seeing it in the fact that Uber has just put a massive dent into the cab company market. But really what we're talking about too is FedEx drivers, UPS drivers, all these big logistics companies, and then of course the big trucking companies that are moving, massive shipping containers to cities all over the United States. And it's actually 3.5 million 18-wheeler drivers that we have, which is like the largest profession, I think, in the United States, something crazy like that. So
for males, yeah, that's correct.
That's an incredible statistic. Now, obviously, I would imagine that this technology is more focused on, small sedans and operating a little bit like more simple vehicles in simpler places. Now, how quickly that technology can be adapted to back up an 18-wheeler into a big cargo station at Walmart or something like that. Maybe there's some added difficulties, but there's no doubt about it that big trucking companies, big logistics companies, their number one problem is getting people in the seats. And in fact, we see this as somewhat of a negative thing because it's going to displace people from work, and I understand that. But at the same time, too, it's trucking companies that are getting our goods to the stores. It's trucking companies that are getting what we want to buy to the places that we want to buy it. And one thing that's really interesting is I think we have 100,000 truck drivers needed in this country. And I would challenge anyone listening to this to go look at the next time they drive behind an 18-wheeler, and every single one of them is trying to get people to come work for them. And you'll see 50 cents a mile. They're always advertising to get more drivers. So really what we're seeing is that it would lower the cost of goods for consumers at the end of the market if they get rid of this massive cost of the drivers that they have right now, and then also are able to fill the gap of the drivers that they can't fill in the seats right now because the demand for drivers is just too great.
Right. And if you said that the number one concern of trucking companies is getting drivers, certainly the second biggest concern is drivers doing their jobs properly and not falling asleep at the wheel and not doing all of these other things that we're all capable of doing. So if a logistics company can invest in a perfect driver, essentially a perfect driver who follows the rules, and by the way, can drive 24/7, not 8-hour shifts with a little cargo bed in the back so they can sleep. We're talking about round the clock transportation services. Professional drivers are going to get eaten. It's just going to happen. It's going to start probably with the taxi industry and then the truck driving industry. So we're talking about 5 million displaced jobs in the United States alone. What's going to happen to them is a really good question. Naturally, I think that drivers could be thinking about other benefits that they can offer to this new economy of the driverless world. Maybe they can help in planning and coordination and other kind of backseat logistics roles where they're not actually in the driver's seat, but they're in a headquarters conducting or trafficking vehicles around. It's hard to say for sure, but some big changes are coming there. And then here's a pretty interesting one to think about: the police force. A wild statistic is that 40% of police encounters in the United States are traffic related. So they're pulling people over or they're attending to accidents that have happened on the highways. What happens when 40% of a policeman's job is now gone? I mean, they have additional free time, certainly, but what does that mean for policing in general? I don't know. These are questions that are sort of open-ended and left to discussion. If you have any thoughts about it, Cade, we could go into it.
Yeah, well, obviously, I think it frees up a lot of policemen to do things that are a lot more important than regulating safety. Now, I'm not at all saying that we don't need policemen regulating vehicles. We do need them doing that. What I'm saying is that they could be doing more important things if that wasn't an option for people to go 80 and a 50. I'm glad that they do that. I know that that's a good thing. Also, I think it would eliminate a lot of need for policemen to some extent because of that, massive amount of time that they spend doing things that are really not essential for protecting safety and keeping lives safe and things like that. So it's absolutely going to be disruptive to a bunch of things. But I want us to think less myopically about this topic and remember that this is what technology does. This is what technology has been doing for years and years and years and years and years. And guess what? When all these people are not working at their standard jobs, we're going to have computers that are doing the task for them. When you think about it, driving a vehicle is just doing a task. And if we can get a computer to do that and free up the creative mind of the human being, I think that there's a lot of creative potential. A lot of those guys are going to go out and do things that are going to be really positive for the economy, or people are going to see a need where they can get some cheap labor in the short term and create other industries. All this stuff is going to be good. And then economically, I can only see this leading to goods and services costs that are connected to driving going way, way down as you see the costs going down.
To build on your comment about how labor, as we understand it, is shifting due to technology, not just in the autonomous vehicle space, I think it's helpful to think about the two things that human beings have been doing for, I would argue, tens of thousands of years better than any other entity or human form of life on this planet. The first, a lot better than animals. We're much better at building things. We're much better at any kind of physical task. But now we've constructed machines that can do it better than us for the first time. Now robots build the cars. We don't physically sit there and construct the cars anymore. And maybe we're not even going to be driving the cars anymore. And there are only really a few other sort of technical, like physical, laborious tasks that humans do better than machines at the moment. One would be brain surgery, which I think of very similarly as to somebody who's constructing a building. It's just far more minute. But once machines can do these things, we're left with the only other thing we do better than anything else, and that would be cognitive abilities. So I think you're absolutely right. What can we do in terms of using our brain powers to make the world function better? Because physically, we've basically run ourselves out of a job.
Yeah, I kind of like this story that Steve Jobs tells, and I can't remember the animal, but basically these scientists did a test of how efficiently an animal could get from one point to another over a certain distance, certain period of time. I can't really remember what it was, and I can't remember the name of the animal that won, but the fact of the matter is that human beings were down at like the 70, 80%, like really, really low, not competing very, very well. But when you put that human being on a bicycle, it doubled the speed of the number one animal. So it's kind of an interesting thing because Steve Jobs is always talking about creatorship. And what we do best is creating new things. And so in the short term, there's going to be some economic ramifications that are going to be real, that are going to take food off the table of certain people. But that's just the part of the pain of us moving forward as a society. And I think we could think about lots of different technologies that we enjoy in our lives that ultimately have had a negative ramification on a small group of people, but for the larger group of people have really derived a lot of benefits from. And it's ultimately been a good step forward because, like I said, it unlocks the potential of people to do other things with their time. If I, at my job, never had to do and only got to think, I would be really excited because I think there's a lot of other things that I could figure out how to do better than what I'm doing today if I didn't spend so much time putting stuff into a spreadsheet and, preparing a presentation and putting things into PowerPoint. And I really kind of liken that to someone just steering the wheel, right? And making sure it doesn't go in between the lines.
Personally, I think it's a very exciting time, but it's a time that maybe in our education system or elsewhere, we have to foster mindsets of entrepreneurialism. I think it's really the entrepreneurs that are going to succeed in this next generation, this next wave of technological advancement, because there's just not going to be the need for the data spreadsheet Excel wizard anymore. And so it's not just autonomous cars disrupting workers that are driving cars. This is happening across the line. So we've got to foster some way to teach people to think and create and innovate, the one thing that we do best. But there are other kind of there are a couple of other major industries that are potentially going to get eaten. All these other industries that are related to the automobiles, like local mechanics and car dealers and car washers, auto parts stores. All of these kind of guys could be in the mix as well for getting kind of disrupted. But what about big oil, Cade? This is the really exciting one. This is the one we talked about last week to some degree, but the impacts of the autonomous vehicle on big oil could be enormous.
Yeah, well, I think so. And I think only so much as it relates to the fact that it will be so much cheaper if that self-driving vehicle, right, I'm going to generate money from driving 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In today's society, they're going to have to do that with an internal combustion engine vehicle for the most part. And that's going to be a ton of cost on fuel and things like that, right? So what I'm saying is that the drive towards automating vehicles without people is going to work in concert with electric vehicles to lower the cost so that ultimately these companies like Uber and Lyft and other types of transportation companies that are going to be unlocked from this technology they're going to work in concert with each other. So I see them both affecting each other. And what that's really going to do is affect the oil industry in a negative way for sure.
Yeah. I mean, there was one sort of scary message that came from Ryan Lance, who's the CEO of ConocoPhillips, right? Your kind of sister company. He said that electric vehicles weren't going to have an impact in his lifetime. He told that to Bloomberg magazine. And he might be right that the average American citizen isn't going to own an electric vehicle. You can go back and listen to our previous episode if you want to get into that debate. But I'm really concerned that he and potentially other leaders in the industry aren't thinking about the autonomous vehicle in an era in which we no longer own vehicles at all. In 2014, the oil crisis was basically caused by having too much supply. Well, what happens when human beings no longer own 2.9 cars in the United States like we do today, and we're functioning on electric vehicles? I suspect there would be too much supply when it comes to the oil status. So those are, enormous questions for those big companies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, I would also argue, Shane, that if Ryan Lance comes out and says, yeah, I think electric vehicles are going to put a big dent into the oil industry in the next 5 years, the stock price of ConocoPhillips would have halved, and it's already halved since the oil downturn. So I'm not sure we can really take that quote and latch onto it too directly. I would argue that all of this change has happened moderately. Even if we haven't paid attention to it, it really has happened moderately over time. But it's a hard thing to sit in my seat where I'm getting my paycheck from an oil company and say that I really do want us moving in this direction. But it's really all founded upon the hope and the faith that we've always found things to do. That's just what human beings have done since they've existed. We've always found ways to cultivate the earth and subdue it. And there are other things in the earth that need to be subdued. And the great thing is there's problems that we're not thinking about. There's no doubt about it. There's problems that are so far out there that we're not thinking about. And when we unlock the capacity of the human mind to stop thinking about the near future and start thinking about the long-term future, you get a guy like Elon Musk when you can free his mind up to think about things like that. So I think it will create us a lot more forward-thinking folks, and that we might get a heads up on some problems that might be time sensitive. So those are all that's the silver lining if you're the truck driver family, right? If you make your money off of these kind of laborious logistics jobs.
Yeah, and I'm sure that oil companies are thinking about this stuff, but there is just one interesting thought line to follow before we move on, and that is that if Tesla today manages to meet their sales targets, which notoriously they do not, but let's say they manage to meet their sales targets over the coming years, and if electric vehicles manufacturing maintain their current market share today, so no additional in-cap in market share, each electric vehicle would potentially displace 15 barrels of oil per year. That would be the projection. And so with that many electric vehicles as are on target right now, according to Tesla's sales, you would displace 2 million barrels of oil per day by 2023. By 2023, if things stay on trajectory. Now, certainly they could not. And certainly there's other twists that we're certainly not considering right now. But the ramifications are huge if things stay on track as they are today.
Yeah, there's a lot of other factors that go into that argument, and what makes 2023 the number, and what could it be? Could it just as easily be 2043? A lot of factors that are hard to consider. But
it's based off of sales from Tesla's market targets right now and the current market share of electric vehicles. So if they continue to maintain their current status, by 2023, there'll be enough electric vehicles to where every single electric vehicle will displace 15 barrels of oil per year. And that would displace 2 million barrels of oil per day. Now, if we no longer need to consume that many barrels of oil for there to not be a crisis, that's one thing. But it does look like it's very likely there'll be that many barrels of oil per day displaced, not needed by 2023.
Yeah, and that's a really big number. I think the U.S. is just under 10 million barrels a day or something like that. So, yes, a significant dent in that markup. But anyways, let's kind of finish up a little bit with what are the things that are going to be birthed, right? We've obviously talked about the proliferation of companies like Lyft and Uber and what it's going to do to logistics companies, which is really actually going to be a good thing, but not for some of the workers in the logistics space. But what kind of organizations are going to be birthed out of this? That's the last thing I kind of want to focus on here. So one thing that's going to be really cool is car companies, right? There's going to be lots of opportunities to make these cars better, to make different types of cars. Shane, you talked about it, right? If you drive in a 6-person car every single day and you're the only one driving it, you're paying, you're taking up space, you're doing all kinds of things that aren't good for you and aren't good for anybody else on the road. So what kind of car companies are going to be birthed out of this? One can only imagine. And that's going to be something that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, the MIT City Car is really fantastic. People should check it out. If you just Google MIT City Car, it's a project that's been in the works for a number of years now. But they've developed a single-person car that takes up the size. I think it's like the width of an entire car, like a normal sedan today. It's only the width of that. So where today a singular sedan would take up so much parking space, one of these vehicles takes up 1/3, so you can fit 3 of them for every single car. And they move on a Z axis, so they actually rotate like in a 360 degrees around the center of the body, so they're far more maneuverable, which is pretty awesome. But that's just one potential disruptor. All these new car companies. Right now, there's a lot of standard car companies. All the big guys are working on electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, but are they thinking about this kind of stuff like MIT was thinking about? How about just the innovations around the battery technology in the fuel cell space? Right now, we basically export all of this work to Asia, and there's not been a ton of innovation. But if there was broad adoption of an autonomous vehicle, certainly startups would be jumping in, trying to make incremental improvements to battery technologies and fuel cells so that these cars could be better and more powerful.
Right, and depending upon how many cars there are, it could even become conceivably rational economically for people to start manufacturing those things in certain places, or at least different parts of the supply chain are going to really create a lot of opportunities. Another thing, obviously, we talk about being entertained in your car while it's driving itself to work. We got to have Wi-Fi in the cars. People are going to be paying for Wi-Fi and data and things like that. So you're going to have tons of wireless network type of opportunities in vehicles and entertainment systems that are really all tied to that, to making sure that time that's in your car is spent looking at something that's interesting to someone else.
And what does insurance look like? Today, I don't know how much you pay in a given month, but it's probably hundreds of dollars to an insurance company. Is that necessary when statistically cars are only crashing, 0.0001% of the time? Probably not, but there'll be startups around the insurance industry for certainty. But the bottom line, I think, is that there's a lot of unforeseen opportunities here. I mean, this would probably be a nice little chunk of space to carve out for yourself if you wanted to start the next cool company that's going to change the world. It's just unlikely that we can even predict what cool things are going to come out of the autonomous space. Just as when the mobile phone was invented, we had no idea it was going to revolutionize transportation in cities the way it has with Uber.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when you look at those companies that have had the biggest amount of change, companies like Apple and companies like Amazon, when they really created a platform for other things. And that's kind of what I see the self-driving car as. It's just going to become a platform. It's a base good or service, I guess, in and of itself. But there's going to be tons and tons of business opportunities that are layered out upon it, just like platforms like Amazon and Apple and other companies like that.
Well, it's an exciting time. Most of the stuff we talk about is pretty forward thinking, but this isn't so forward thinking. It's happening. It's going to be exciting to watch it take place in our lifetime. And I have said in the past that our little nephew, Levi, will never learn to drive a car. It perhaps would be considered unethical for little Levi, who's only 4 years old, to actually learn how to manually drive a car. People will look at that and say, "Are you crazy? That's far too dangerous. Why would we ever let him get behind the wheel of a car?"
Yeah, and after I think it's 2 million miles now that the Google car is gone, and now the technology can learn over time, and that's a whole nother topic in and of itself when technology starts to learn. But it is certainly better than the average 16-year-old.
Sure is. Well, that wraps up our Transportation Revolution series, episode 1 and episode 2. Next week, we're jumping into a beer banter episode. We do one of these every 3 episodes or so. Inevitably, Cade, we're going to jump into current events, sports, politics. I don't know, Sergio Garcia winning the Masters, whatever seems interesting to us at the time, I guess.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right, buddy. Well, that's all I've got, so I will see you later.
All right, see ya.